The important thing to remember about gauges is the lower the gauge, the thicker the wire. And I'm going to start with a 10 gauge wire. This is not one that many wire wrappers use, but there are uses for it. So if you've already been wire shopping, you might notice that there's dead soft and half hard, and you're like, what the heck does that mean? And that's just the malleability of it, or how easily it can bend. So some uses for 10 gauge wire could be bases for bangles, headpieces and crowns, armbands, ear weights for people with gauged ears, sun catchers, sculptures, pretty much anything large. You could maybe make a pendant with it if you have a super duper big capuchon, but most people with large capuchons will use like 16, maybe even 14 gauge, but 10 gauge is pretty thick. So uses for 14 gauge wire, and I'm also going to include 16 gauge wire in this. I don't have any on hand. 14 to 16 gauge wire, depending on the malleability, so whether it's half hard or dead soft, you can use for a lot of the things that I listed previously, so bangles and bracelets. So right here is dead soft. You can see how easily it is for me to manipulate this. Pay attention to my fingers and my fingertips. You'll see they're turning white. That's how hard I'm pressing, and it's not moving very much. Next up, we have 18 gauge. This is a really good base wire. And if you get dead soft, you can also use it for larger capuchons and pendants. So this is good for larger pendants, larger capuchons, for thicker earring bases, chain links, and findings, rings. There's not very many projects where you won't find use for 18 gauge wire. I will say the malleability in this makes a big difference depending on what you're using. With 18 gauge wire, if you use half hard, if you're using it on a smaller project, sometimes it can be a little bit more difficult to form and work with. Whereas dead soft is a little bit easier to use, but that's going to vary person to person, so you just kind of have to experiment. And on the back of these heady pieces, I like to use 18 gauge wire for my bails and the back frame. And this is 20 gauge wire. This is squared wire. I love squared wire. Again, 20 gauge, another great base wire. With squared wire, it has a little bit more of a grip, so it's really ideal for beginners. And when you twist it, it makes this really cool kind of rope design. So with 20 gauge wire, it's again pretty much great for everything that I listed for 18 gauge wire. It'll be more ideal for kind of smaller capuchons and more medium-sized projects, if that makes sense. So 20 gauge is also the gauge that a lot of earring posts are made from. So if you want to make your own earring hoops and the pieces that go through the ear part, you'd want to use 20 gauge. You'll need to file it appropriately and sand it down, but 20 or 21 gauge is ideally what they use for the holes that go through ears. Now we have 22 gauge wire. Again, you can see the difference. 20 gauge is to the left, 22 is to the right. 22 gauge, for most people, you don't find a ton of use for it unless you make really dainty projects. So this is not super durable, even if it is half hard. So it's not really good for making like chain links. On the left is 22, on the right is 20, so you can see the thickness. With really, really tiny capuchons and really tiny beads, 22 gauge gives just a nice dainty look that's more balanced than 20 gauge would, unless you want a thicker look. So this would be good for smaller capuchons, smaller beads, very small details on pendants. It's a little too big to secure anything, and it's too small to use for like a medium to large capuchon, so I ideally like to use the 22 gauge for little bitty capuchons. And next up, we have the thin gauges. So I'm going to start with 24 gauge. 24 gauge is good for weaving and securing, but it's not great for weaving depending on what the base wire is. So if you are finding that your weaves, especially for your bails, are looking kind of clunky, they're just kind of hard to wrap around, you're probably using 24 gauge wire. So I only like to use 24 gauge wire to make weaves like bales and such on top of 18 and up. So think 18, 16, 14 gauge. When I say 18 and up, I mean 18 gauge and thicker. 24 gauge is good for coils. It makes thicker coils. So you could wrap 24 gauge around 20 gauge to just make a coil, no problem. But for weaving specifically, it's not my favorite gauge unless I'm using a thicker base wire. I do like to use 24 gauge to secure certain elements and to make coils. So next we have 26 gauge. This is sterling silver. It's looking a little tarnished. Just ignore that. I use 26 gauge the most. It's a perfect middle ground between 24 and 28. I use it for so many different things. So I use it to make my bales, I use it to secure elements, I use it to wrap around my coils. With 28 gauge wire, it's so thin, and if you don't keep it unkinked, sometimes it can just completely tear off. So that's why I like 26 gauge the most, is depending on the project, I don't really have to worry about that. It's basically like thread, which we love for certain things, but it can be difficult if any of it gets kinked up, or if you pull too hard on it, or you unwind it and rewind it and unwind it and rewind it again, it'll snap off, and it's extremely frustrating when you're almost done with a project and it just snaps. But 28 gauge has a beautiful look. 26 gauge is just a really good middle ground. And finally, we have 28 gauge. I don't really use anything thinner than this, and I wouldn't really recommend anyone use any gauge thinner than this. So here's a comparison. 24 gauge is to the left, 28 is to the right. You can see how skinny it is. So yeah, it definitely has its uses. I love to use it for bales and weaving. The only downside, besides, again, if you get it kinked, is that it just takes a little bit longer because there's just a lot more turns that you have to do because it's so thin. So I'm going to show you the comparison of some bales. The one to the left is not that pretty, but it is a 24 gauge. The one in the middle is 26, and the copper one is 28. So you can definitely see on like the sides, the edges of the base wire, how many extra rows or turns there are. And there's not that big of a difference with the 26 and 28 gauge wire. Maybe if they were the same color, it'd be easier to see. You can definitely tell there's a little bit, a couple extra rows on the copper one. But that is the difference. And again, if you're finding that your weaves and especially your bales are just not as tight as you'd like them to be, see if you're using 24 gauge wire. Again, if you're using it on top of 20, it's going to be difficult. And then finally, I'm going to go over half round wire. It's in the name, half round. So I also call it flat wire. Love this wire. It too can be a little bit difficult like 28 gauge wire, and the fact that you have to be careful about keeping it straight, because if it twists, it's really difficult to untwist it. You have to be careful about not keeping it twisted. But it makes really nice thick coils. So this is a coil, and I like using it to secure the wires at like the bottom of pendants. There's not a lot of gauges that half round wire comes in. I think I usually get like 20 to 22 gauge. Again, there's not a huge variety. I think like the most you'll see is like 19 to 23 gauge. But here to the right, you can see just normal round wire. It's probably like 24 gauge wire. And then the half round is to the left. It's also really nice to secure elements. So if you ever see elements that have that flat wire and you're like, how did they do that? The wire was already flat. I remember I used to think like, are they hammering round wire? And here's an example of a normal coil with round wire compared to the coil with half round wire. It has a nice element. It almost looks like ribbon or kind of like beads. And yeah, as a beginner, that's all you really need to know as a brief rundown and summary of the gauges. I will be making a video soon on the different metal types and breaking down the gauges, malleability of each of the different metal types, go more in detail with that. But I wanted to make a video just kind of breaking down the gauges, because it's really hard as a beginner to find it all in one place where it makes sense.